I just hit go live. Oh, here we go. Hi there, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason, and I'm here with Dr. Lydia McGrew, and we're going to discuss The Mirror or the Mask. And so this is a great book. I highly recommend everybody pick it up. So go ahead and get a copy of it if you haven't read it yet. It takes a little while to read. It's a good investment because there's a ton of research in it. And so we're going to talk about her video series that she made on this book that's in response to a number of different scholars who have posited that the gospel authors took a lot of liberties when they were writing the gospels. And so that seems to be a bit of a problem when you believe, as I do, that the gospel authors wouldn't really have the guts to take liberties when they're writing this narrative. But Lydia actually looked at a lot of the evidence that doesn't come with that presupposition that I tend to have that says, well, this is all God breathed and God would not want people to take liberties. And so I just come with that presupposition, but she actually doesn't come with that. She actually just went and looked at a lot of the evidence inside the Bible and even outside the Bible with authors like Plutarch and others. And she came up with a really good case to say that I don't see these liberties that are taken in the Gospels. And I don't think it's necessary that we think that way. And so before we go over to Lydia, I want to say she has a PhD in English. She is an analytic philosopher. She's published a whole bunch of articles on analytic philosophy. So she deals with some really deep topics. And I'm going to go ahead and let her introduce herself and then we'll get going. So without further ado, Lydia.
Hey, thanks for having me, SJ. It's fun to be on. People who've seen my work before, they know a bit about me. I'm an analytic philosopher and an independent scholar. I write on topics like testimony, evidence, testimony independence of testimonial evidence. I do probability theory, and I analyze the way that applies to these topics. These are obviously relevant, very relevant topics for the Gospels and for the philosophy of religion. And I've got a number of publications also applying theory of knowledge areas to the philosophy of religion. In 2009, my husband Tim and I wrote the article on the resurrection of Jesus for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, making a historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus. And then since then, I've published a lot more on the probabilistic issues that spun off from that in secular journals and also in the philosophy of religion. Then a few years ago, I began writing in New Testament studies. In 2017, I published Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. I think we've done an interview on undesigned coincidences before. And then in this past December 2019, The Mirror or the Mask came out, subtitled Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. And I've recently finished the draft of my forthcoming book on the Gospel of John, which will be called The Eye of the Beholder. And that is with the publisher right now being put into advanced reading copies that can then be sent to, blurbers and reviewers and so forth. So that's where that's at. So I'm sort of an English PhD turned analytic philosopher turned New Testament scholar. And I do keep up. I'm also planning to go back and publish more in philosophy as well. And I'm also a homeschooling mom. I have one remaining homeschooling student here at home that will be finishing up her high school in the next year. So that's who I am.
Great. And one of the things I just want to point out in case the audience doesn't realize this, but from an academic perspective, is a person who has one degree and who wants to bridge the gap between her degree and another degree can do so by just publishing in that field. And so you can gain legitimacy. And I know this from AACSB, which is a business accreditation. If we want to have people who earn a degree in, say, leadership education, and they want to come over and teach in business and they want to teach leadership related fields, all they have to do is start publishing papers that are legitimately, high level papers in business, and they can bridge the gap and be considered scholarly academics in the field, that field. So it's a kind of a cool bridge program that places the accreditors use. So the fact that Lydia is kind of crossing over a little bit from English and into the New Testament studies is completely legitimate as far as a scholar, because she's doing it by publishing in the New Testament area. And so again, I highly recommend take a look at this book. If you haven't, it's The Mirror or the Mask. And so Lydia, what would you say are what would you say is the major point here in the mirror and the mask, like kind of the key idea you want to get out?
Well, I consider to have a negative and a positive vector to the mirror or the mask. So on the one hand, in an earlier part of the book, I am refuting these ideas that the gospel authors believed that they were licensed to take liberties, and I'm refuting it at multiple different levels, both in terms of the secular literature and in terms of what the gospel said about themselves, and a lot of different levels there. And then in the latter part of the book, I'm going with the positive vector, which is evidence for what I call the reportage model, which is, I mean, that's just my coined word. It's not anything new. It's the way that Christians, and particularly evangelicals and commentators and so forth, have looked at the Gospels for a long time, that they were always attempting to tell the truth. They were not, changing or making things up. And they were also very highly successful in doing that. So I bring forward positive evidence. And I also argue, and I argue this in the video series, SJ mentioned as well, that the reportage model is very much at odds with that common compositional device model. Those are in severe probabilistic tension with one another. So evidence for the reportage model is in itself evidence against the compositional device model. So that those are sort of the two thrusts of the book.
Yeah, good. And so I think we should probably, just in case the audience is unaware of what some of this stuff, let's see if we can give an example of a time when you feel like some of these other scholars, and I'm not really naming names, although we can name names, but some other scholars have felt that like John, for example, took some liberties. And where would be an example of what they're claiming?
Sure. So a pretty famous example, and it's one that has a surprising number of scholars on board with it, concerns the temple cleansing. So in the Gospel of John, in John 2, Jesus cleanses the temple, and he goes in there and he makes a whip and he drives out the money changers and so forth. I would agree that with others that John places that very firmly there at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He's been narrating Jesus' ministry, early ministry, right along, and then he says the time of the Passover was near at hand. This is also the visit to Jerusalem where Nicodemus comes by night and speaks to Jesus. So I would say it's pretty firmly anchored in time there at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. When you go to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you find a description of Jesus cleansing the temple, and it's broadly similar. He drives out the money changers and so forth. There are different details that are mentioned and reported, but the big difference is that they anchor it very firmly at the over at the end of Jesus' ministry. In fact, it's in Passion Week, either Sunday or Monday probably of Passion Week when Jesus does that. So then people will say, well, we appear to have a contradiction. And I would say that he did it twice, just the way that we might have multiple political protests now that would take place, or we might have multiple times when a group of pro-life people would go and pray outside of an abortion clinic or something of that kind. And you could even have some similarities of events that would happen at times, but they would be different occasions. So that's what I think is true. But these scholars often will say that John moved it, and that he so Dr. Craig Keener takes this position, Dr. Michael Licona, and also Dr. William Lane Craig, that he located it earlier in Jesus' ministry, even though it did not take place earlier in Jesus' ministry. And then there are these conjectures concerning possible theological symbolism that might have had in John's mind, and how his readers were supposed to shall we say, intuit that theological symbolism. I don't really know, because it's really rather complex. So, for example, Dr. Keener's theory about the symbolism is that by doing that, he symbolically placed Jesus' entire ministry within Passion Week. That somehow it was like Jesus' whole life was one long passion or something like that. Now, how the readers were supposed to, read John's mind to know that that was the symbol he meant, I really don't know. But that would be an example of a compositional device view.
Yeah, and that's an interesting example, and I mean I do agree that I think that there definitely was during Passion Week that event, because I think that's what really stirred up the Pharisees towards the end. But the
There were a
Pharisees
lot of
were
things.
also chasing after him the entire time, so it's also, we could probably make an argument that he also went out there and did that at the beginning. So I can see where you can make that argument. So that's, and there's another one that kind of comes to mind that you said that I really didn't like. I felt that you don't even need to make this kind of argument between Galilee and Jerusalem as far as where Jesus appeared. And so I wanted to see if you wanted to say a little bit about that, because
Sure.
yeah, that's one that kind of, it seems like the Gospels are easy enough just to read them as they say they go, and to put them together without having to say, okay, the author just made this one up.
Right. Well, so you do have these sort of shortened accounts of Jesus' appearances after his resurrection in Luke and in Matthew. Both Luke and Matthew seem a little rushed at the end if you read them. So, for example, Matthew only tells about Jesus meeting them in Galilee. So he tells about the women meeting Jesus, and then that they had this message: tell my brother and my disciples to go to Galilee and I'll meet them there. Then he kind of takes whatever extra space he might have had on his scroll, to tell the story of the guard at the tomb. And that's only in Matthew. And then he kind of backtracks and he says, the disciples proceeded to Galilee. And then he tells about Jesus seeing them there, and that's where Jesus gives the Great Commission: go ye therefore and teach all nations, and so forth. And that's the only meeting that Matthew tells with the group of the male disciples. Then when you're in Luke, again, each author kind of chooses how he's going to use his time, how he's going to use his space. So in Luke takes a lot of space to tell about the meeting between Jesus and the men on the road to Emmaus. And that, again, it's unique to Luke. And he goes like blow by blow, where they're sad, and Jesus meets them. Why are you sad? And they say, oh, are you a stranger that you don't know what's been happening, et cetera, et cetera. You know how that story goes. And then they come back and to Jerusalem all excited and tell the disciples that they've seen Jesus. And then he appears there in Jerusalem. Now, at that point, Luke he gets his skates on. Okay, just in those last few verses of Luke 24, from about verse 44 onward, he uses this particle. It's the particle de in Greek that does not have to have a temporal meaning at all. And I have plenty of Greek scholars to back me up on that. You could translate it just as but. He opened the scriptures. He told them the things concerning himself. He led them out to Bethany, and there he was parted from them, and so forth. So it's like he's almost summarizing those events. Then in Acts 1, Luke clarifies that Jesus was actually on the earth for 40 days before he ascended into heaven. So the only one that Luke tells about is in Jerusalem. So Dr. Licona argues pretty specifically, and over a couple of pages in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, that Luke had decided he was going to put all of the events on Easter Sunday, like everything, including the Ascension. Not just that he was narrating briefly and leaving stuff out, but that he actually meant to be narrating it as if it all happened on that day. And then, of course, Galilee's too far away. They wouldn't be able to walk to Galilee in that time. And so then he suggests and has made this even clearer in a debate with Bart Ehrman that Luke moved that meeting from Galilee to Jerusalem. Now, the interesting thing is that Luke is independently confirmed on this by John. John also says that he first met them on the evening of the day, Resurrection Sunday, in Jerusalem, and then again 8 days later, still in Jerusalem, and then they went to Galilee. So John sort of fleshes it out as well. So, I don't know if what's John supposed to have done. Did he move it too? He doesn't address that question, but that would be another example of an alleged compositional device.
Yeah, and that's a good one, because I was just thinking to myself, as you just told us, if we look into Luke's, we can see, for example, part of this whole process playing out on Sunday. So like we could agree with the road to Emmaus. We know it did happen on that Sunday. Jesus went and had dinner with them. Then suddenly he disappeared. Then suddenly he appears where the apostles were in the house. And so, but we also know he appeared before that just to Peter, and he appeared before that just to Mary Magdalene, and he appeared to the women before that. And so that there's, and I don't know exactly what order that he appeared to these different people, except for the females at least, because the First Corinthians gives us how he appeared to the males and the 500. And so we have that kind of evidence. And we also know that he went to Galilee in over a 40-day period. So it's totally reasonable to think that first he appeared in Jerusalem when they were still kind of in hiding, because they said that in one of them. And then he also appeared a week later to the doubting Thomas. And at some point he also appeared in Galilee and eventually ascended. And he also appeared to John and Peter when they were out fishing once, for example.
And that's in Galilee.
Yeah, in Galilee. So that brings us there. So I don't see a reason to have to come up with this modification that says that the authors were sort of playing games with it when we had plenty of time over this 40-day period. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I would. And I think here's how it arises. It's a mistaken method. And in this mistaken method, what you do is you take a document and you read it in isolation, from any other document, and you get your first impression. And then you sort of, set that first impression in place. So suppose that you did have just Luke. Suppose all we had was Luke. Then you might get the impression that he ascended on that day, and that he never left Jerusalem. Now, even so, there are little hints because he probably didn't ascend after dark. And Luke is sort of laying things out. And you're like, man, isn't it getting late? I mean, because it says he opened to them the scriptures and told them all things concerning himself. It's like, that's a pretty long Sunday evening sermon, So even there, you might begin to wonder how he's fitting it all in. But if you didn't happen to think of that, you might get the impression, that first impression, that he never left Jerusalem and he never went to Galilee. And they never went to Galilee. Okay, then you go and you take just Matthew, right? And it's like, what if we just had Matthew? You read Matthew alone. Well, Matthew doesn't mention the men seeing him at all in Jerusalem. So he just says, but the 11, proceeded to Galilee. So you might get the idea, okay, he just appeared in Galilee to the men if you just read Matthew. And then the idea is you don't allow yourself to combine. You say, well, if that's my first impression, then I have to stick with that. And then if these first impressions are in conflict, it would be wrong or strained or ad hoc or something like that for me to try to put them together. Bart Ehrman, the notorious skeptic scholar, is very strong in advocating this method, and I would call him a bully. I would say that Bart Ehrman is a bully. I think I'm allowed to say that because he's not a Christian. I'm not allowed to say negative things about Christians, but I can say Bart Ehrman is a bully, and he pushes. He calls it, for us to try to put the accounts together, he says, well, that's writing your own gospel. He says, and that's fine if you want to do that, if you want to write your own gospel, but that's not the way to deal with the gospels that we actually have. Well, I've never seen any of these scholars use that, exact Ehrman phrase, writing your own gospels, but I'm afraid they are using something of that same method, that we're not allowed to quote unquote write our own gospel. We just have to take our initial impressions and seal them in stone. And that's not a good historical method at all.
I don't think so too, because that comes with all kinds of presuppositions. And I just found one of my own, because I had this presupposition that the first time Jesus appeared to the disciples, the male disciples, they were all together and Peter was with them for the first time. That's when Peter saw him. But then I went back and I looked at what Luke says, that he appeared to Peter first, and 1 Corinthians 15. And I thought, wait a second, there must have been an individual separate appearance to Peter. However, I didn't, like in my presuppositional idea that I had taken, because when I had read these, I just missed that somehow. And so that's a problem. I mean, that can be, you don't want to do that. And I agree with you. Why do you think these guys have this problem with, and you mentioned it in your book and you've also mentioned it in other places, but actually before I say that, I want to mention something. You pointed out that Luke says right here, he appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God in the book of Acts, in Acts 1. And so Luke did know that this is a longer period of time. And so there's potential to go other places besides just be stuck in Jerusalem. But this other thing is, why do you think they have a problem with trying to put together the accounts. Like a lot of people have tried to reconcile, going back to even ancient times, the four accounts. And it seems like Bart Ehrman, and you've mentioned some of these other scholars who seem like they're against doing that. And I can't figure out why.
Right. Well, as an epistemologist, I've done quite a bit of work on the topic of ad hocness. Now, very broadly and in popular terms, an ad hoc hypothesis is something that you add without any independent evidence just in order to try to save your theory. That's putting it in a popular way. But, suppose that I had a theory that someone broke into my house last night and then somebody points out to me, well, none of the doors or windows are open. All right. Then I say, well, these are really, really clever burglars because they have a way of like locking everything, even the deadbolt behind them. I don't know how they do it, but they do. Now that's a classic ad hoc hypothesis, right? I have no independent evidence that there's even such a thing as a way to lock a deadbolt behind you without leaving a trace. Okay. I invented it totally to try to save my theory. So I think that these scholars believe that it would be ad hoc to put the accounts together. They think, well, that's just because you're trying to save a presupposition of inerrancy or something. And if we're more sort of, what should I say, more open-minded as historians, then we're not going to try to put these together to try to save inerrancy. We're just going to go wherever the evidence leads, et cetera, et cetera. And so then they think that this thing of locking them in place, your initial impressions and not combining them is the only way not to be ad hoc. And that's my most charitable interpretation of why they do it. And you'll notice sometimes when a scholar will refer to this is called harmonizing, he'll use the word strained or artificial. And after a few times of that, where every time somebody says, well, strained harmonizations, artificial harmonizations, you start to get, I think they pass around among themselves, this impression that the majority, not all, they'll occasionally harmonize, but that the majority of harmonizations are strained, artificial, and ad hoc. And so then it gets a bad reputation. And then they think this is how I should be a good scholar and a scholar of integrity, is by not doing that.
Yeah, and see, I completely disagree, because I look at, for example, the resurrection account of Jesus. We know he was on the cross for a while, and people get all wound up over what his last words were. And I'm like, well, his last words could easily be what his words were over that period of time while he was on the cross. They didn't have to be the very last words. And it never says these are the only two last words he said right before, So.
Exactly. Yes, there's this phrase, the last logion. That word logia just drives me crazy. It's a bit of scholar jargon. It just means saying. So, the last saying recorded in John is finished, if I recall correctly, and recorded in Luke is into thy hands I commit my spirit. Well, the fact that it's the last saying recorded doesn't mean, nowhere does it say, and this was the very last thing he said. Now, it may say he died or something, but he could have said, it is finished takes like 1 second to say.
Yeah.
He could have said one more thing. And D.A. Carson uses a great phrase, the scholar D.A. Carson, a small amount of historical imagination. And that's what I think we need. And when we get a sense of the robustness and the way that human life really works, then we realize this is not ad hoc. This is actually a good way to find out what happened, to use a small amount of historical imagination. This is why I think someone like J. Warner Wallace, who's a detective, or I got an email from a British judge, and I can't remember his name right now, but who takes this same approach. So, people who work regularly with human testimony and human events, things that people have witnessed, they witness a murder or a car accident or whatever, or they're trying to tell you what happened. You get a sense of how messy that is and how many more details there are than you would ever guess, and how things can both be true that you would have thought were in conflict, and so forth.
That's so true. That's another good point. And I have to admit, I like J. Warner Wallace's work too. Cold Case Christianity is great. And And so I have a question here for you from the audience, from Stephen Rivard. He says, can you get, and this is, I think, going to relate to a lot of what you said on paraphrasing in one of your videos. He says, can you get her to talk about how God inspired men providentially to write the Bible in their own fallible but honest account of events, rather than the stereotype that every single word was telegraphed into their minds? So I guess there's two views that, I mean, Paul actually made it pretty clear that a lot of the stuff that came to Paul was from God. He said that. And so he said the scripture is God breathed. However, is there any latitude we have with the gospel authors paraphrasing some of Jesus's words that he might have said maybe on the Mount or some other places?
Sure. Well, you don't have to accept that something is necessarily fallible. So we've got to separate several different things here. There's the inerrancy issue, that's over here. There's the issue of paraphrase, that's its own issue. And then there's the issue of what I might call reporting naturally. Okay, so you can report naturally, and that's related to paraphrase. You can report naturally in a way that doesn't even have an error in it. So I gave an example in my one of my videos. I was talking about, suppose I were talking about one of my daughters who's more practical than the others, and I said to her in front of other people, "You are my most practical child." And then somebody went away and reported that, just this natural witness variation. And Lydia turned to her and said, "This is my most practical child." Like, this is trivial verbal variation. And I don't think that should be called an error, because we know that natural witness testimony, you get these trivial variations, and that this person is not claiming to give us a verbatim transcript. So that's what we might call natural reporting, that involves natural paraphrase, but that is not, I mean, the person is fallible, but I wouldn't necessarily say that in this case that's an instance of his being fallible. So we can actually use these kinds of theories, like what I've just been talking about, the messiness and so forth, without necessarily even attributing an error. There might be cases where someone who's not an inerrantist, I don't consider myself an inerrantist, but someone who's not an inerrantist would attribute an error. But even before we get to that, we can have this kind of, natural witness testimony that just supplements one another in these ways that are partial, which isn't necessarily the same thing as being fallible.
Yeah, and I think that helps explain why sometimes the wording between the synoptics is slightly different. And I think that's fair game. That means the same, but the people might have expressed it slightly differently from their recollection, but it still has the same meaning.
Absolutely. Some years ago, Daryl Bach wrote an article. Now, I don't agree with everything in this article, but I'd like to borrow his title. So his title was about reporting words of Jesus, and he used the phrase live, jive, or Memorex. So I suppose Memorex, I'm dating myself, but Memorex is, it's a tape recorder, right?
Yeah.
So Memorex would be this verbatim, absolutely verbatim recording. Jive would be like, say, a Cohenine community made up, I am the light of the world, because they had been reflecting on Jesus' teaching and they felt that he really was the light of the world, so they put that into his mouth. I would definitely call that jive. And then live would be like what we just were talking about, where you have just this natural variation, or possibly a partial, a summary. You might shorten what was said, and only report part of it, because you don't have all of it, or you don't remember all of it. That's sort of live reporting. Now, as I say, I'm not saying that Bach would agree with all of my positions, or that I would agree with all of his, but I like that tripartite distinction, live, jive, and Memorex. And so I think we can definitely make use of that, and we need to be careful when scholars use the term paraphrase, or when they say, "Oh, we don't have a verbatim recording," that we say, "Okay, tell me more about what you mean by that." Because, as I gave examples in my video series, unfortunately, those phrases and those statements are sometimes used to support what definitely I think should count as jive, and not be called paraphrase for the Johannine community to make it up. Or we talked about Jesus' last words on the cross. If Jesus really said, "Father, into your hands I commit your spirit," or something very close to that, and then John made up, "It is finished," Like he was sort of, we might say, inspired by Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so I'm going to have him say, it is finished. That's not a paraphrase. Because they mean quite different things. And so that's a theory that Dr. Licona has borrowed from Dr. Daniel Wallace, that John changed into your hands I commit my spirit to it is finished. I don't think we should call that paraphrase. So whenever a scholar says the authors may have paraphrased, now it behooves us, unfortunately, to ask him to elaborate and say, now please tell me your most controversial thing that you think counts as paraphrase. Don't tell me your least controversial thing. Tell me your most controversial thing that you think counts as paraphrase. But was there paraphrase? Sure, absolutely. And that's an important part of the reportage model, actually.
Yeah, well, I actually I want to build up on one of the things that you mentioned there, because it also very much bugged me, the fact that I firmly believe that John, the apostle, who made it at the very end of the Gospels, made it really clear that he was telling an accurate account, and it was based on testimony of eyewitnesses and that sort of thing. He made that really clear, that he would make up a whole bunch of I am statements, and because he felt they felt good and they reminded him of Jesus or something, rather than having Jesus actually say those 7 I am statements. And so what do these authors, these other people posit about that? Because I know that you said you've discovered that some of them say they take some serious liberties on that.
Right. So some of this came to light in 2017. A clip came out again. I mean, it'd been out there for a while on Bart Ehrman's channel, but a clip was taken from that, and then you can go watch the entire video of a 2012, actually there are 2 videos, 2012 series of debates, 2 nights back to back, very similar debates that Craig A. Evans did in Canada with Bart Ehrman. And in the course of that, they were talking about the Gospels, and Evans was pretty strong that the Gospel of John is just a separate thing. It's just its own thing. And that our primary sources, historical sources for the life of Jesus, are the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, at one point, Ehrman even summarized him. He said, but you're not going to use the Gospel of John as a historical source for the life of Jesus because you think it's metaphorical. And you can hear right on the tape, Evans says, fair enough. So, I mean, he granted that summary of his position, and he made a number of statements specifically about the I am sayings. And it kind of started because Ehrman asked about not just before Abraham was I am, but then also about I am Father are one. This is a big theme of Ehrman's, that the high Christology in the Gospel of John is added, that it's made up. Jesus didn't really say those things, and you can go watch it for yourself. You can find quotations in my book. Dr. Evans definitely seemed to be agreeing with him. But then he also elaborated on that specifically for the I am sayings with what are called predicates. So this would be like, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, life, etc. And in a question and answer from the audience, not even being, badgered by Ehrman or whatever, he elaborated on that. And he said he attributed it to what he called the community that is responsible, that it comes together in the aftermath of Easter, that is responsible for the version of the Gospel of John that we have. So, he's not really there attributing it just to one author. Like there might have been an author back of it, but then this community added on to it and so forth. They believed that, Jesus had these other teachings, and that because of those other teachings, then he really was the light of the world. So it's sort of like it's true to his teaching, is the way he would put it. It's true to what he taught. It's true to like the, I don't know, essence of Jesus' message or something, that they made up these things with predicates. And he said they go back to Jesus, not because he really said them. He said they go back to him, not because he walked around and said them, but because they're based on his other teachings. So that would be the theory, and it's a very strong theory, but it shows the extent to which the Gospel of John is treated as a special case, we should say, so that these theories of liberties are taken a good deal farther with John than with the synoptics, which is why I've chosen to write a separate book just on John.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I actually don't like that. I mean, just the idea of trying to take that separately and trying to make an assumption that people were sort of injecting their own message into the gospel. I think that would be something that those who put the canon together would have totally frowned upon. They would never have allowed a bunch of people to be injecting their thoughts into what they considered scripture and God breathed scripture. So that's a tough one.
Well, and it's interesting, we have a quotation from Papias. And so, Papias is like the early second century. He's a very early church father. And he talks about how he wanted to, whenever he could, uh, he was in Ephesus, I believe, in Asia Minor. He would talk to people who had actually known Jesus, actually met Jesus. And he said that he didn't want just the teachings of other people, but that and I'm paraphrasing now, I don't have it memorized word for word, but that he wanted the teaching, and then he used the phrase proceeding from the truth itself. And that's a very Johannine phrase in itself. I think that's evidence that he had access to the Gospel of John, because what he's doing is he's referring to Jesus as the truth. So that's, I am the truth, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and so forth, proceeding from the truth itself, so that it was Jesus' own teaching accurately reported that Papias wanted. So that shows an emphasis upon that quite early on during that time when the canon was being formed, as you said.
Yeah, yeah, and it also reminds me of something that you talked about in one of your videos. You also mentioned this idea of the Greek study. They made the assumption that these people who are making these hypotheses now make the assumption that the apostles might have been trained under Greek studies, and according to them, the Greek studies mean you can take these great liberties with your writing, and you can invent stories and insert them and do that sort of thing. And when they don't have evidence that the apostles themselves had that same Greek training and rhetoric, instead what they'll do is they posited that, or Mike Licona posited that must mean that these apostles must have had secretaries who must have been Greek. And I think that's really just taking a huge stretch himself.
You want to talk about ad hoc? I mean, if we're going to talk about an ad hoc theory that you're bringing up to save the appearances, yeah. I mean, here's why I don't think he recognizes the ad hocness of that. Because a lot of people did have secretaries. Okay, I mean, that was no big deal. As he said in his videos, Paul had amanuenses, they were called. In fact, one of them even gives his name as Tertius. So he's melding together the idea of a secretary, who would be someone like, suppose you yourself were not good at writing, like hand, because everything had to be handwritten, who would take dictation, might improve your language a little bit, like just your grammar, we would maybe think of almost a copy editor, kind of melding together the role of a secretary and a copy editor. Actually, even within our own lifetime, there have been secretaries who've taken letter dictation for, business moguls or whatever. So that we have independent evidence for, but that's not the same thing as this kind of a co-author who's going to say, hey, do you mind if I change when Jesus cleansed the temple? Or maybe they didn't ask, I don't know, what the theory is exactly, but that's literally changing the events. That's not just a secretary. And we don't have independent evidence for that at all, and certainly not for the gospel. So that ends up being a very, very ad hoc theory, where you have a Jewish author who's maybe never heard of this, but then you've got a Greek secretary, quote unquote secretary, I would say co-author, who says, hey, let's add this thing in there that you've never heard of. And then the Matthew or John says, oh, fine, sure, go ahead. That's very implausible as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of, and I agree. I think I think we don't have evidence for that. So I think that to posit that seems kind of silly, but the other thing I want to mention that you brought up, and I think that people have this kind of, they think, oh, wait a second, it's no way that these people could memorize what Jesus said. So all of the red letters in the Bible must be just made up from the apostles trying to craft the story a few years, or some people say, oh, decades later, they were trying to recall exactly what he said. But I wanted to say something about the oral tradition, because people really placed a high emphasis on memorizing stuff. And so it's a very likely case that they would memorize creeds and events and maybe even repeat them to each other as they're traveling around from church to church, spreading the good news. And so by the time they wrote it down, maybe they had the whole Matthew 5, for example, all memorized. Everything about the that event.
The Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, everything about the Sermon on the Mount could be completely memorized because they had been traveling around. That was their culture. Only 90% of people, 90% of people are illiterate, is my understanding, and so that means a lot of memorization came into play. So it's different than today when we do have these Memorex or ways to tape record our voices, and we're kind of have lazier minds that we don't have to memorize things that people say, but they really had to back then.
There are great feats of memory recounted of people who said, oh yeah, I can remember all of these dialogues and so forth at the time. Moreover, there actually was such a thing as note taking at the time, and scholar John Wenham talks about note taking, and Matthew may have taken notes of Jesus' teaching, so that's a possibility. The other thing I think we can remember is that when a person is a witness and then he himself tells what he remembers, as I think you were just suggesting, that act itself fits it into his own mind and fixes it in place. I think we sometimes think of oral tradition as being for the benefit of the hearers. Oral tradition is also for the benefit of the speaker, of the one who's passing it on. So if you're John, okay, and you remember, I'm going to talk about a different discourse, but what Jesus said to his disciples on the night of the Last Supper, the night in which he was betrayed, which is one of those longer sections in John. It's still not as long as the Sermon on the Mount, by the way, but anyway, and you start preaching this to people, right? You start telling them, and this is what he said: I am the vine, you are the branches. If you abide in me and my words abide in you. The very act of preaching that, I think, is going to help him to remember it. So it's not as though John is just decades later, for the very first time, thinking back, now, what was it again that Jesus said on that night when he's been thinking about it all along. So I think that definitely would help.
Yeah, and I think that would help memorize the parables too, because I'm sure those were little memorized little capsules, little nuggets that they memorized. And so, I mean, I do think, I think that people unfortunately take today's modern lens and try to apply it to ancient times. And I think that you miss a lot of the things. And that's one of the strengths of your book is, did you want to speak to your investigations on Plutarch?
Sure. Oh, yeah. So I mentioned earlier in our discussion here that I tackle these things on multiple levels. And here's what I mean by that. So, like, you have to ask all these different things. Did these literary devices even exist in the Greek literature, in the Roman literature at all? All right. Suppose we said that they did. Well, then would the gospel authors even have heard of them? Especially the ones who were not Greek trained. So we just discussed that. Well, maybe not. So it could break down. It could break down at the level of saying these didn't even exist. It could break down at the level of saying the gospel authors would never even have heard of them, even if they did exist. It could break down at the level of saying, well, if they'd heard of them, they would have said, no, I'm not going to do that. Thank you. I'm going to tell it the way it really happened. I mean, just because you've heard of something, I know of memoirs that have been written nowadays that take liberties with history, but if I wrote my memoirs, I wouldn't do that. So, just because I've heard of something doesn't mean I'm going to do it. So you've got all these multiple different levels at which the argument could break down. The Plutarch research that I did is taking us back to that first question. Did these devices even exist? So you take something like displacement in time. I gave an example, supposed displacement of the temple cleansing. Well, the claim is, well, Plutarch did that. He displaced things in time. So you go and you look, and again and again, what I found in the Plutarch passages is that either you could harmonize them, and there's nothing wrong with harmonizing Plutarch. It's not, harmonization's not just for scripture. You could say, well, no, I mean, actually, this could have happened twice, or actually, he doesn't say that happened on that day. You're taking it that in this life, he said that a life was what they were called. They were lives. They were biographies. In this biography, he's saying it happened on this day. In this biography, he's saying it happened on that way, that day. That's actually an overinterpretation. He doesn't actually say what day it happened on. So yeah, they could be referring to the same event, but there's no controversy, no contradiction. So you could do that. And of course, with Plutarch, nobody's even beginning to be committed to the inerrancy of Plutarch. So it's pretty easy to just say, maybe Plutarch made a mistake. And he might have read a source. Now, these are big scrolls, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to look stuff up. So to say, oh, when did that happen? Which trip to Spain was that? When Julius Caesar was weeping about not having accomplished enough. This is one of the places where Plutarch supposedly moved something. Oh, darn, that scroll's all rolled up and it's in the other room. And, I'm not going to go unroll it and look it back up. I think it was this one. And, he writes it down that way. So that's a perfectly natural thing without saying there was this literary device. And Plutarch said, I shall move it by 7 years in order to make a literary point. That's just it's an overly heavy, overly complex hypothesis when we consider all of these sort of more ordinary real world, again, that small amount of historical imagination, things that happen in our own in our own lives all the time, that can account for either real discrepancies or apparent discrepancies. So I found that to be the case repeatedly with Plutarch.
Yeah, well, I would say also, just to add to that point, I think that the idea, when you mentioned time a little bit with the Gospels, we know that Luke made it a really big point to write in an orderly account. So he wanted to write everything chronologically. But apparently, according to the way that I've heard, ancient authors didn't necessarily write chronologically. They would write in the way they wanted to present events sometimes, and maybe just in the order they thought, not necessarily chronologically, that made sense to them for whatever reason. And so
Well,
make it. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no. So I was just going to say so that helps to account for sometimes when it seems like something might appear earlier, but yet the author might have, it might have gone a little bit later.
Right. Well, that's a real important topic, and I'd like to address that. I do want to say one thing about Luke. I'm not convinced that when he says an orderly account, he means chronological orderly account. I think he may mean orderly in an ideological way or in a way that's set forth carefully, because actually Luke, of all the Gospels, he's kind of tied with Matthew here, but very strongly. He has an entire section. It's sometimes called the central section, sometimes called the travel section. It's a lot of chapters. I think it's from like midway through chapter 9 all the way to chapter, I think it's 16 or something, where he just has all this material, and you can tell he didn't know when a lot of it happened. And he'll go, as he was walking along, he just throws it in there, as the crowds were increasing, he said, well, when were the crowds increasing? Who knows? It's just sort of chunked in there. That's extra material. So I don't think he's always even, able to, to make something chronological, and then he's sort of in a sense honest about that. He doesn't pretend that he knows if he doesn't know. But as far as not always writing chronologically, this is a very important issue, and I addressed it in my video series, my book, and blogs in many places. The statement that someone doesn't always write chronologically can have two meanings. One of them is what you just meant. I know this is what you just meant when you said it, which is what I call achronological narration, which is kind of like what I just said about Luke, or what I said about Luke at the end with Luke 24, when he kind of gets in a rush, but you should just translate it as but, if you translate the connective at all, where you're not intending to give a specific chronological impression. Now, we do this now. I think ancient authors did it somewhat more, but we do it now. I might say, yesterday I worked on getting my new computer set up, and I fed my caterpillars. I raised caterpillars, fed my caterpillars, and I cooked, I cooked supper, and I thought about my interview with SJ or whatever. And I'm just going, I'm not trying to tell you that I did it in that order. In fact, I've fed the caterpillars many times, because they're eating all the time. So, I'm not trying to give you an order of events. That sense is the sense in which it's true to say that ancient authors didn't always write chronologically. The other meaning of that word, and people get confused about this, is what I've coined the term dyschronological narration. Dr. Licona calls it synthetic chronological placement. That's his terminology, whatever, which is, like I said about the temple cleansing, which is literally moving it like I'm going to make it happen at a time when it didn't really happen. Or Luke putting the ascension on Easter Sunday. It's not just like you could get that impression. The idea is that he's actually meaning to, in his story there, have it happen on Easter Sunday when it didn't. Now, in that sense, I don't think there was a sort of common ancient thing. If somebody did that, people would be confused, just like they would be, confused nowadays. So we need to distinguish those, but it certainly is true that at times they narrate in a way that is not intended to convey a chronology. Now, you can debate whether an author intends to imply a chronology or not. And people do this. There are even some people, and I disagree with them, who think that when John narrates that temple cleansing early, he's using what I call a chronological narration, that he's just narrating it early in his gospel, but he's not trying to make it look like it happened early in the ministry. Now, that I disagree with. I think it's very clear that he's making it happen early in Jesus' ministry, and that's why I think that it happened twice. But there are scholars who will say, no, John, they're not saying John moved it in the sense that I discussed before, that just chronological sense. They're just saying he moved it in the sense of narrating it early. And, in a sense, I agree with them that John didn't change events, but I disagree with them that John wasn't intending to imply that it happened early.
Yeah, one of the and I think those are all really good points, and I agree with you on that. Like I could say today I went to Taco Bell, took my son to get his hair cut, and I rode my bike, but definitely not in that order. I
Right,
wasn't trying
right,
to tell you
right.
in order, so I agree with you on that. And I think I agree that I think that's how the gospel authors would have done it. So I mean, I think that there would be, if they weren't intending in some cases to put things exactly in a certain order. I think that's fair to say. But I want to go back to Matthew, because in Matthew, there's one event that isn't in any of the other gospels. And it's when Jesus resurrected. I'm sorry, no, when he was crucified and he died, and suddenly the temple veil torn, and the guard actually was so surprised and acknowledged, oh my gosh, this must be the Son of God. And then all of a sudden they said the saints rose up. And this idea of the saints rising up, Dr. Licona has said that he thinks that's referring to maybe a metaphor that the author just decided to insert in there that didn't have any sort of backing historically. And I disagree with that. I don't see that as just a metaphor. I actually see it as a fulfilled prophecy, because there were prophecies in the Old Testament that actually predicted that was going to happen. But I'm wondering, because we don't have another historical source that points to that, do we have to accept this idea that it was just a metaphor, or can we just say maybe there's just one source for this event and it could be historical?
Yeah, we always have to be willing to accept the idea of just one source. I mean, if we think of all the things in history for which we just have a single source, or of all the things that that only one person told you, it would be a very poor historical principle to say that everything has to be attested twice. Everything, we got to have duplicates of everything. Um, that would be a poor principle. That's the principle that Bart Ehrman is applying when he challenges the I am sayings in John, because they're only in John. He says, aha, this is only in John. Well, why wouldn't the other authors discuss them? And it's a very weak argument from silence. There are strong arguments from silence, and there are weak arguments from silence. A strong argument from silence would be, there is no dragon in my room right now, because I don't see one. I would see one if he were here. Okay, well, that's strong because dragons are very large, okay? But a weak argument from silence would be that if John is the only one who reports the I am sayings, or Matthew's the only one who reports the raising of the saints, then it didn't happen because nobody else did. That would be a weak argument from silence. Now, that's not, in fact, Dr. Licona's argument. He's concerned with what I might call the weirdness factor there. That's how I would put it. The weirdness factor, so for example, he'll ask, well, where were they? If they rose on Good Friday, and then it says they entered into the city after Jesus was risen, were they just kind of hanging out in their tombs for 3 days? That seems weird, or that kind of thing. The passage sounds kind of weird. I often feel that part of the reason for people to doubt that passage is literally just that Matthew gives so few details. And I would ask anybody who doubts the raising of the saints to ask himself psychologically how much of his doubt is a result of the brevity of Luke's account. Matthew's account there. Because you'd think with something like this, you'd think he'd go into more detail, maybe name some of the people or tell about how somebody met them. And I would say that's probably a result of the fact that maybe he did not have any more detail. Maybe he got this story about that at, secondhand or something like that. And so that he tells us what he has and what he knows. The Temple Veil and the earthquake, those are, of course, attested in the other synoptics as well. Those are not only in Matthew. The other thing that I think is a really telling point is this. It says the centurion saw the earthquake. It says when the centurion saw the earthquake and the things that were done, he was astonished or afraid or whatever. Now, Dr. Licona will use the phrase an earth-shaking event, which I take to mean that he's questioning the historicity of the earthquake as well, even though that's not only in Matthew, kind of interesting, but he'll put that earthquake together with the raising of the saints, and he'll say, these are like what we might call prodigies. Sometimes the word prodigy will be used for crazy things that the ancient authors would relate happened, prodigies like a lamb spoke or whatever. Now, I want to just say right here about prodigies, I don't think we can definitely say they didn't believe them. Just because we think something is bizarre and we think it didn't happen, that doesn't mean that Josephus doesn't actually believe it happened. Maybe he was superstitious. Maybe he did believe it happened. So let's just start there. But Licona will, put those together and he'll say, someone might say 911 was an earth-shaking event, but that doesn't mean there was an earthquake at the time of 911. And what I would point out is that nobody says, and when the first responders saw the earthquake, right? I mean, if we said that, we would take it, okay, I guess there really was an earthquake. So the fact that it says that the centurion saw the earthquake and the things that were done, I'm not saying he saw the saints rising. What I'm saying is it says that he saw one of these so-called apocalyptic events, one of these so-called, prodigies or metaphoric events. So I think that ties it in a historical way that Matthew is intending to narrate, historically. It's just seamless. And I've written a blog post about that. I have a footnote to that in The Mirror or the Mask. I tried to separate that one out a little because I felt that so much attention had been focused on that raising of the saints in the years prior to 2017, when Dr. Licona's book, Why Are the Differences in the Gospels, came out, that people got a false idea that that's what this was all about. I mean, literally, you would see people, you disagree with Michael Licona? That must be about that raising of the saints thing. Like literally, it was just this one thing. And so I wanted to correct that impression. So that's why I discussed it in one of the reasons. There were other reasons why I discussed it in a blog post rather than devoting a chapter or section of the book to it. But I definitely don't think there are historical reasons to take that to not be historical.
Yeah, no, great answer. I agree with you on that. And I think that even saying that why not as a historian, why not just go look at the geological data and find out what investigators today who are looking into geology have said about an earthquake in 33? Because I actually looked at a bunch of academic literature in geology, and I found that there is evidence that in the year 33, and this is one of the few years, the year before that was 31 BC. So 31 BC and 33, there were earthquakes in Jerusalem at the Dead Sea Basin. They found seismite activity and they found a bunch of evidence for that. And so why not just look at that? If you want to try to find some other external support, we can find it. It's there. And so I go crazy when I say, well, why not? Why not just look into, if we have something related to history, look into some other source of history. If you've got something that we could find from geology, look into geology. And so I don't understand that.
Yeah, well, it's a geologically unstable region. It definitely is a geologically unstable region. There could even have been earthquakes that we, don't have the other evidence of, in these various years that are conjectured when Jesus might have died. So that's not implausible at all. I mean, nowadays we even occasionally get earthquakes in surprising places. We had a tiny little one even here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in the Midwest, but a few years ago, which is very surprising. But I totally understand if somebody says there was an earthquake in Iowa, then you're going to say, okay, was this miraculous or what? Because there aren't usually, if I'm not mistaken, I think there are not usually earthquakes in Iowa. But in this case, it could have even just been a natural event that sort of providentially occurred at that striking moment. I think the darkness and the rending of the veil, and obviously the raising of the saints, those were miraculous events. But yeah, I see no reason to question it at all, as far as for historical reasons, unless you have a bias against the miraculous. But obviously that's a whole different issue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's definitely some people who have a bias against, and that reminded me of something I wanted to also ask you. Speaking of biases against the miraculous, what do you think about their take on a couple of the people you've mentioned? I don't remember if it was Craig Evans or if it was Mike Licona, but they had this view that the blind man, maybe Jesus didn't really cure this blind man, and it was just added in as a literary device. It's an example of a literary device.
Well, it was the number. The number of blind men is what it was. It was so odd. Not that Jesus never healed the blind. That wasn't the position, but it was Dr. Licona and Dr. Craig Keener. So there's a place in Matthew where it mentions Jesus healed 2 blind men. This is in Jericho. He heals 2 blind men. There's another place where it mentions that he healed 2 demoniacs, cast demons out of them. And then when it looks like those same stories are in Mark, it just mentions 1. In fact, Mark names Bartimaeus. That's blind Bartimaeus. So the way I would put it is that Dr. Licona has a menu, of possibilities there as to what might be going on, and he just kind of lays it out. He just kind of pick your own favorite or whatever, and puts them all, apparently on a par. And one of those items, which Dr. Keener has actually advocated, is that Matthew doubled the number. He just like multiplied the blind men by 2 and the demoniacs by 2. And so, like Jesus really did heal 1, but he doubled it. And the reason for that is the part that just blows my mind. I discussed this in my video series. It's that there were other stories in Mark where Jesus heals a single blind man. Like there was one outside of Bethsaida, if I'm not mistaken, where Jesus healed just 1 blind man. And that Matthew doesn't tell those. And then the idea was that Matthew multiplied by 2 in Jericho to, quote, compensate for not telling a completely separate story. Now think about this. I mean, if you had 2 friends who had flat tires and told you flat tire stories, would you tell one flat tire story in which you had the 2 friends be together? It's like, oh, they were both there and there were 2 flat tires on the car or something like that. Well, I'm compensating. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense. How does that even compensate? So what I called this in my video series, I called this the game token view of Jesus healings. So we've got like little game tokens shaped like little blind men, right? And here we've got a game token of a blind man healed in Bethsaida, and here we got a game token of a blind man healed in Jericho. And as long as we've got the same number of game tokens, it all comes out in the wash. So, Matthew goes and grabs the game token from Bethsaida and puts him in Jericho and says, okay, Jesus healed 2 blind men in Jericho. That's enormously implausible. And to try to call that a literary device or even find some literary device that would support that, I do not see the evidence at all.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. Now I'm getting some questions in the audience here, and one of them has been going on for a little while. I forgot who just asked it. I got to double check. But can you speak to how Jesus was called Emmanuel, and then was predicted to be called Emmanuel in Isaiah 7:14, and then when he came, we now refer to him as Jesus? Do you know? Have you given any thought to that?
Well, the verse does say, shall be called his name Emmanuel, which is God with us. I mean, that, now was that a double fulfillment? There can be these double fulfillments where something happens originally, and that's like the first fulfillment, but then the Holy Spirit has this extra meaning, that the later authors discerned. So maybe there was a child in the Old Testament times, whose name was to be called Emmanuel, to show, that God was on the side of Israel, he was with Israel, or something like that. But Matthew certainly, and quite understandably, takes it to mean God with us, and to be a foretelling. Jesus' name is Yeshua, which is that God saves, and it was one of the more popular names in that place and time, actually. And that's one reason why you find the characters always referring to him as Jesus of Nazareth, because they would have to say, which Jesus they're talking about. So that was just his name that the angel told, according to the Gospels, the angel told Mary to name him. And both of those are obviously, appropriate, whereas Emmanuel would not have been a sort of a normal, name to call someone at the time, but Yeshua would be, but then also had this meaning that, God is our salvation.
Yeah, good. And so that's those are great answers. And that's also this idea of the double meanings, which, like 3 days and 3 nights with Jonah, had a couple of meanings at the time and also for future on. So I think that's good. I wanted to answer a question. Somebody was asking me about my sources for this when I just made a statement about the earthquakes occurring, and they said, well, they see a 10-year span. No, you can actually go to Kagan. The citation is Kagan. Hold on one second. I just had it in front of me. Darn it, where'd it go? Hold on. Oh, there it is. Kagan, Stein, Agnon, and Newman, 2011. It's titled Intrabasin Paleo Earthquake and Quiescence Correlation of the Late Holocene Dead Sea, from the Journal of Geophysical Research. And so you can also go to another one by Migowski, Agnon, Bookman, and Nagarnik and Stein. And that's that's from the year 2004 in the Harvard Theological Review. Those are just a couple, but there's a whole bunch of them. I've got a blog on this, and I'll link the blog into the description so you guys can take a look at that. But I have another question for you, Lydia. It says, can Lydia speak about the scribes and the teaching they had and the influence on the writing of the Gospels?
Can the person specify which scribal teaching he has in mind?
That's a good one. Jesse, you want to clarify on that? So see if he says that which the scribes and the teaching they had and the influence. I guess one of the things that I've seen are people try to pretend that the scribes would take liberties themselves and correct things or add things or do something like that. And that's where you get to the Bart Ehrman telephone game, where suddenly you've got the scribes, and with each progressive scribe, we've got more mistakes potential. And
well,
so
we've got a lot of copies, and that enables us to catch these things sometimes. So that's why there are manuscripts where they say, I think that was a scribal edition, we don't use that manuscript. So for example, when Jesus was baptized, there is a text family, and Bart himself will use this text family, and he really shouldn't, where it's the Father says, "You are my beloved Son," and then the scribe appears to have added, maybe he only meant to add it in the margin or something as an annotation, and then it got incorporated. "This day have I begotten you." So he's incorporating part of a psalm, of course, that is then also quoted in the book of Hebrews, maybe after the book of Hebrews was written, and applied this to Jesus. So that's not probably in the original text of Luke, that the Father said, "You are my Son, this day have I begotten you." So that would be an example of a scribal addition. Those did occasionally happen, but then we could we can catch those, and they're actually sometimes pretty blatant. There are others that are more subtle or more difficult, and people argue about them and so forth. But I don't think that there are major textual problems in the New Testament. Now, textual scholarship is not my specialty, but we have to distinguish New Testament scholarship more broadly, the interpretation and so forth, from textual scholarship. I do try to take account of textual issues where they are going to be, relevant. There were one or two undesigned coincidences, one in particular that J.J. Blunt from the 19th century makes use of, that I did not use because it was called into question by a later textual issue in the Book of Acts. But in general, I don't think the textual problems undermine any of this, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is even Bart Ehrman agrees with you. So we talked about him a little bit, but he wrote this book, Misquoting Jesus. And in the second version, in the appendix, he made a comment about what if he and Bruce Metzger, his mentor, who was a Christian, got together and really hammered it out as far as what was in the New Testament originally and what we have today. He said all of the core tenets of Christianity have been preserved. So even though he wrote this whole book on misquoting Jesus, and he pulled that little comment that he made because people were using it against him in debates. That's where I first heard of it.
Yeah, some years ago, well, I hope I don't get this wrong, but I think Metzger was still alive. And my husband talked to him on the telephone. And this is going back years ago. Not like they were good friends or whatever, but he managed to get hold of him. This is when people still use telephones, to just call up scholars instead of emailing them. And Metzger himself was kind of distressed at some of the directions that Ehrman had gone, and the scholarly decisions he made about which textual families to rely upon when it was pretty obvious that those were dubious. So in a sense, Bart is relying on things that, he can tell are historically and dubious in a scholarly way to try to make it sound like there's more of a problem than there really is.
Yes, that's what I see. I feel like that's what he does because he makes a mountain out of the fact that Jesus, that there's that, what do they call it, the Johannine period or something like that, where they
Joining
talk about
comma,
the
that's in
comma. Yeah, that's it.
John, the three that bear witness in heaven, that adds a Trinitarian formula there. Yeah, I mean that's
Yeah. So that's just one of those things. I'm looking at the thing. Another person, Dr. McGrew, are you familiar with the Cabourus Codex? And I'm not. So that's
no, I'm not.
Khabouris. You haven't heard? Yeah.
No, I'm not.
I haven't heard that. Okay, so so you guys, if you have questions, just tag me. Jesse Camping says, thank you. That was the answer he was looking for.
Okay, there we go.
An answer. And I see something else here. Wait, hold on one second. Let me just try to get this question that was just up there a little bit. By the way, I pasted the source that I was referring to before in the chat on different days. Remember, this is not, oh wait, no, they're talking about slavery here. That's kind of getting off topic. Let's just say if we can get to another channel. Oh, I don't see. Okay, I don't see another question from this group here. But I'm not, I still think that now what else would you say as far as people who are going to study under these different people who are out there teaching this kind of stuff? How do you think how would you, how would you advise, say if it's your daughter, I know you've got a few daughters, how would you advise your daughters if they were going to study under people like Bart Ehrman or Mike Licona or other people who have these views that are in stark contrast to some of the views that you and I share? So how would you advise that they handle that in the classroom?
No, I would definitely want to put Licona and Ehrman in different categories. Of course, one is a Christian and one isn't. But that whole question of classroom etiquette is an interesting one. I think a lot of it depends on the personality of the teacher and how much the teacher can handle pushback and how the student can push back in a way that is respectful of the teacher, but that nonetheless is well informed. And I have not really read a lot of reports or heard a lot of reports about what either of those gentlemen is like, in the classroom as a classroom teacher. But a good professional teacher can handle disagreement from the students, and the students, I guess I would also advise the students not to be so afraid of their grade that they appear to be affirming something as their own conclusion that they don't really hold. You can always add to something. What we were taught in class was, and that's generally good advice for attending college in general. If you attend a class where they teach something that you don't agree with, you can also, according to what we were taught in class, you can put it there. And then, you're not affirming it. You're reproducing what you were taught. If you're concerned that dissent is going to cause a problem, that hopefully the professor can handle that. But I guess I would always advise someone who's studying these various scholars to go ahead and look things up for themselves. I guess that would be my strongest piece of advice, not just to someone who's going to take a class, but who's investigating these things. Don't be pushed around by credentials or just by a phrase like the consensus of scholarship. This is what the majority of scholars think A, sometimes that consensus is exaggerated.
Or wrong.
Well, that too, but sometimes it's not even the case, it was interesting in my debate with Craig Evans on the Gospel of John in 2018. He actually said all critical scholars believe that Matthew composed his discourses by taking, teachings of Jesus at other times and putting them together. Well, at the time I said, I'm not necessarily close to that, but I would have to look into it more. Well, it turns out that D.A. Carson doesn't think that Matthew did that. He thinks that all of the Sermon on the Mount was told, at that given time. Now, I don't know, maybe Craig Evans is going to say D.A. Carson doesn't count as a critical scholar. I mean, that would be a bold statement, I think, but I just think he didn't know, and these guys will exaggerate. They'll say, in one of his videos, Dr. Licona said something to the effect that the majority of evangelical scholars today agree with him about the compositional devices, the Greco-Roman compositional devices in the Gospels. It's like, which ones? Maybe if we find some harmless sounding thing like, spotlighting or something, maybe the majority of evangelical scholars agree with him about that. But about a lot of these others, no. That's just not true. So don't be overwhelmed by those kinds of statements. Do your own research. Have the confidence, and don't assume that you know what a scholar believes because you assume, well, he wouldn't say that. Maybe that really is his position, even if it sounds implausible. Above all, don't get involved in what I might call, social media debates on the basis of what you presume is what people think. I can't count the number of times I've seen people do that. They'll say, Lydia McGrew is wrong. And someone will say, well, what's she wrong about? Have you read, any of her work? Nope, I haven't read any of her. Well, how do you know she's wrong?
Yeah.
Mike Licona is right. Okay, have you read his book? No, I haven't read his book. Well, how do you know he's right? It's astonishing. So go out there, do the homework. Whoever you are, if you're going to study under these people, if you're just going to be a layman and watch their videos or whatever, actually dig down into it and get the nitty gritty, because you might be surprised.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that actually you're right. I think Mike Licona, I've had him on my channel. I think he's a nice guy. He's got a good heart, and I think he wouldn't do the students wrong. I think he genuinely believes the position he believes. I just disagree with that position. Right. And so I just wanted to point that out. I also wanted to point out that you have in this book a whole bunch of people who've signed off and on it. So people like Peter Williams that I just mentioned, I've been binge watching his videos. J.P. Moreland, Craig Blomberg. You've got a whole bunch of really big names in here. Here's a president of the St. Constantine School, John Mark Reynolds. A lot of big names that have that obviously are not in support of all of this stuff. And Jonathan McClatchy, I've had him on my channel. He's a great guy. But you've got some really good sources and good backing here. So that's just another little thing to point out.
Yeah, they're good endorsements. And, some of the people that Americans may not have heard of, it's partly because they're American. So, if somebody hasn't heard of Peter J. Williams, maybe that's because he's a British scholar. Or, Edgar Wallace is a physicist. He's a very well-known British physicist who's endorsed it. Now, you can say, oh, he's a physicist. What does he know about New Testament scholarship? But the point is that some of these, it kind of depends on your location and your background, whether you've heard of a person, before. But I am very pleased with the endorsements that I got there. And one person I just want to give a shout out, J.P. Moreland has just been on an unfailing encouragement again and again, trying to get the word out, about my work. And he doesn't participate personally on social media. He has someone who manages his social media accounts for him, but and that's why you probably haven't heard quite as much about my stuff, but he's tweeted out things that I've done and or told his manager to do that. And he's been so encouraging at a time when particularly sometimes when I've felt a little bit discouraged and maybe in need of some encouragement. So
yeah, that's good. And I really liked your book. And I think that you and I, and actually everybody else, including the people we've named today, I think everybody's on a quest for truth. It's just that, like you said, when you come into the truth with this presupposition that your initial perceptions of a book must be the correct perceptions and you didn't miss anything and there's no other way to interpret it but the one way that you initially perceived it, well, then there's an issue. Like, for example, we know that Judas hanged himself and we know that he fell headlong into a field. Some people claim that that's a contradiction because they make all kinds of different assumptions. Now, what if Judas was on a cliff? There's lots of cliffs in the area where he hung himself or hanged himself. And what if when he fell, he kind of tumbled a little bit and ended up going head first? Or what if he was hanging by his feet? I mean, there's all these different things that we could come in there with an assumption that he was in flat land on, his neck, he fell down and then he hit his head. I mean, there's other ways to look at things that could easily reconcile some of the stuff that people say is irreconcilable because they hold these really wooden positions.
Well, and there's a couple of good points there. First of all, it doesn't even say that he fell head first. It says he fell headlong. And the word is prone, the word we would use for prone. So all he has to do is fall on his stomach. It's not like a complete somersault. Well, that's pretty easy, even if he is hanging from his neck. You get a wind, right? And the branch makes smack, on your stomach. So a lot of times atheists will take headlong and they'll change it to head first. And it's important to catch them there, that nobody's saying Judas somersaulted around and landed literally right on the very tippy top of his head. That's not what it says. So that's one thing. The other thing was a good point that Peter Williams made in his debate with Bart Ehrman, which is that you could almost say there's a confirmation between them, because it says he fell and all of his bowels burst out. Well, normally, if you just fall, if you just trip or something, all of your bowels aren't going to burst out. So he said already we're looking for a height. Just from that description in Acts, we're looking for a height. And then Matthew gives us a height because he hung himself. So I thought that was a good point that Peter Williams made there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I as I said, I've been binge watching his stuff. And so I like he actually has made a whole bunch of points on some of the names and some of the lesser known people who are involved in the Gospels, and giving it early dating, because we have a lot of these people recalled that you don't see later on in the Gnostics. And so he goes into great depth in that.
And the name statistics as well is something he does so well, where we actually find the typical names in the Gospels that were typical of that place and time. They're not being brought in from foreign areas. Even in the Jewish diaspora, the names were not all the same in all the areas. So that's an important thing to remember. And helps us, or like what I was mentioning before, the fact that Jesus' name was so common. This is a great distinction that Peter notices, that the characters in the Gospels always have some other term for Jesus: of Nazareth, or who is called the Christ, or Jesus the Nazarene, or the son of Joseph, some other term. But the narrator always just says Jesus. Well, why is that? Well, because the narrator's there's no other Jesus that the narrator is thinking of, right? But the characters in the story, the people who are milling around, they know lots of Jesuses. They know lots of people named Yeshua. So they have to add that extra term. And it's this very consistent distinction between the narrator not using a separate term and the characters using a separate term. That's just a little mark of accuracy and realism there in the documents.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we're coming up on an hour and a half, and I wanted to see if we wanted to, you mentioned you're working on, I think you said a couple more books. I know you've got one on John. Could you just give everyone who just joined us a little bit of information about what you're working on?
Right. So I've recently finished my manuscript of my book on John. It's to be called The Eye of the Beholder, John being, of course, the beholder. And I take again, it's got a positive vector and a negative vector, kind of like what I said about the mirror or the mask. So I give a lot of positive evidence for John that I'm bringing in from other scholars who are dead, scholars who are alive, that I'm bringing to bear. And then I'm also responding specifically to many of the arguments that have been made against John, like the temple cleansing, like his Christology is too high, and these various things. And again, as in the mirror of the mask, my focus is on things that have apparently captured the attention of evangelicals. So my idea is it's I mean, I'm making it hard for myself. It's too easy for us to kind of be a little bit tribalist and to say, well, the only people who are doing those things are those really liberal, non-Christian, non-evangelical scholars over there. So it's us against them. And what I'm doing instead is saying, well, unfortunately, it's kind of us against us. There are evangelicals who have found some of these things, they've considered them so strong, allegedly, quote unquote. I mean, I don't think they're strong, but that's how it struck them, that it's caused them to question the historical genre of the Gospel of John. So I want to tackle those that are taken as toughies or hard things, and show how specifically the arguments that have apparently convinced evangelical scholars to call into question the historicity of John are incorrect, but then to present also a mountain of evidence. Some of it I don't I don't think it's ever been brought together in one place. I'm not saying it's all original. Some of it's original, but to put it all in one place of that evidence for historicity. Then I also discuss authorship, because authorship is a big, big topic, and I have a whole big long appendix. It's almost a booklet in itself on authorship and a chapter on authorship. And I do have some original work there as well, including an argument that the author was was one of the 12 that I don't believe has been sufficiently emphasized previously in the literature that I've read. So that's fun. And I've gotten that manuscript now. It's with my publisher, and he is typesetting it, as you might say, virtually typesetting it into a form to make what's called an advanced reading copy, which we will then offer to reviewers and blurbers when he's got that ready.
Good. Because I actually think, and I just want to go into John just for a second here, because I think that there's a lot of evidence in the synoptics that John and Peter were very close, and they were both fishermen. And it seems like, I think John was working with Peter before, when they first were discovered. And who went with Peter into the temple, the hall where Jesus was going to be judged and placed in front of the Pharisees? Was the apostle, the beloved apostle. The other apostle went with Peter. And I feel like that was probably John. He probably had some relationship with the Pharisees, and that they let him go and view Jesus's trial, and they let him see all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like I would love to see if there's some outside information that maybe like Zebedee was a great friend of Caiaphas or something like that, and that's why John got in there. But I've never found anything. But I think
not that I know
cool
of. In fact, yeah, that's used as an argument that he wasn't the son of Zebedee. Very famous argument, because how would this? It's kind of a snobby argument, How would this mere Galilean fishmonger? They'll use that, fish seller. How would he be known to the high priest? Well, that's something I go into in a lot of detail in that appendix. That known doesn't have to mean that they were dear buddies. It can just mean an acquaintance. It doesn't have to mean that they were the closest of friends or something. In fact, if they had been, he probably would have known Jesus was a disciple, and he wouldn't have wanted, that John was a disciple, he wouldn't have wanted to let him in. But notice that it never says that he spoke to the high priest. The high priest, by the way, would have probably been a Sadducee rather than a Pharisee, but it never says he spoke to the high priest. It says he spoke to the girl at the door. So he only has to be known well enough to get in the door, and to say for Peter, oh, he's a friend of mine, let him in as well. If he's around and about, and he could be a distant relative, there are all sorts of distant kin relationships, or he could be involved in the fish trade, various possibilities, just known well enough that he can get them into that courtyard there. And I think that's very probable. But yeah, that's actually used against authorship by the son of Zebedee. They'll use it to argue he must have been, a high-born Jerusalemite. But something I bring out and emphasize is that he appears to have been a fisherman. Specifically, one thing I talk about, I've never seen this in the literature, is Peter says, I'm going to go fishing in John 21, and they fished at night typically, because you could see, like, they would probably light lanterns. I mean, the Greek fishermen still do this, the peasants, and look down, and to try to see where the fish are. So they're going to go at night. I'm going to go fishing, and several of the others say, we'll go with you, including the beloved disciple. And I believe it says 7 total. Well, okay, if he's just a landlubber from a high-born young Sadducee from Jerusalem, why is he going to go out fishing all night with Peter on the Sea of Galilee? Like, you wouldn't think that would be attractive. I can think of plenty of people who are city slickers. If you said, "Hey, let's go out fishing all night," you'd be like, "That's fine. I think I'll go to bed." So I think there's definitely evidence there and in other passages that he knows the Sea of Galilee and that he is not just a Jerusalem resident who's unfamiliar with Galilee and unfamiliar with fishing. So I think that's actually evidence that he was the son of Zebedee. Anyway, we should probably wrap it up.
Yeah. No, I want to just say one last thing as far as the son of Zebedee. Zebedee, a fisherman, people make the assumption that they're on some little rowboat or something like that. I mean, this was a pretty prosperous business for people back in those days. And so I don't think he was just this poor fishmonger that we would assume today, this guy who's sitting out in a rowboat. But I think they were pretty decent, they could fit all of these people in it when they were all going out. So.
Well, it varied. I mean, you could have just one guy in a boat, but it actually mentions bigger boats and smaller boats in the Gospels. But here's the thing. It specifically says he left his father with I believe it used the phrase servants, the hired men. So yes. The Zebedee family evidently had employees. So as as traders, they themselves were not some, despised group of people.
Yeah. Good. Well, listen, Dr. McGrew, I'm so happy you came in here today. I know you've been on my channel a few times, and I asked you to come on again because I watched your videos. I watched all of them. So I don't remember if I don't think I linked those yet. So I'm going to link those in the video description so everybody can get access to those.
Yes.
They're really fascinating. 7 videos on the mirror and the mask. And of course, you might want to follow that up with her book on the mirror and the mask, or even her book on undesigned coincidences that's called Hidden in Plain View. I've also read that book. I couldn't find it in my bookshelf to bring it up here and show it to you guys in time, but that's another great book. And so thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, SJ. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Thank you, everybody, for coming in here.
Thank you.
Please like, subscribe, do come again. And just remember, Jesus is the way, the path, the truth, and the light, I should say. All right, here we go.
Cool. That was fun.
Yeah, that was.